Hello and welcome to this special edition of From the South as millions of Democratic Party voters head to their local primaries in what's called Super Tuesday to select who they want as their presidential candidate. I'm Camila Escalante here in Quito, and with me is Martin Pastor. He's an editor here at Telesur English.
Hello everyone, thank you for having me.
Now, over the next hour, we'll have all the news and analysis from Super Tuesday. It's a Democratic presidential race that has slowly turned into a Bernie Sanders versus the rest contest. Voting is just ending in the first eastern states of Vermont and Virginia. And in the next half hour, the vote will also close in the state of North Carolina. In all, voting has been taking place in 14 states and the U.S. territory of Samoa, as well as among Democrats abroad. Sanders is seeking to cement his position as the frontrunner and fend off a challenge from former Vice President Joe Biden under Barack Obama, who has gained momentum following his recent victory in South Carolina. Despite endorsements from candidates who have dropped out, Biden still trails Sanders in the delegate count and in national polls.
I definitely, when I first saw that Buttigieg dropped out, my thought is maybe that he's polling with Biden for maybe doing a VP and they're trying to pull votes. So it's interesting to see. I feel like going forward, Bernie's always kind of had a tough fight ahead of him. And if he gets that nomination, that'll be huge. And I feel like we're just going to have to take it step by step. It's definitely an uphill battle.
Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders and his wife cast their ballots in Burlington. A total of 1,357 delegates are at stake, with one candidate needing almost 2,000 to win the nomination at the party convention in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in July. So far, Sanders has built a strong momentum, with his rivals uniting to unseat him as the main frontrunner to challenge Donald Trump.
Number one, we are determined to defeat the most dangerous president in the modern history of our country, a president who's a pathological liar, a president who is running a corrupt administration, and a president who is attempting to undermine American democracy.
On Monday, Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar became the second Democrat to withdraw her presidential bid in less than 24 hours. Klobuchar made the announcement and then endorsed rival Joe Biden in what analysts see as an effort to unify voters against Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders.
All eyes are on North Carolina.
And on Sunday night, Pete Buttigieg announced that he was pulling out of the race after he ranked fourth with just 8% of the votes in South Carolina. Buttigieg was the first openly gay presidential candidate from a major party in the United States. A short while ago, our correspondent Jorge Gestoso in Washington, D.C. told us how Super Tuesday had been going so far.
So far, so good. It's about an hour and 20 minutes for some polls to close. We're talking about the East Coast, and also California is 3 hours earlier, so we have to wait. So far, there is no complaints, no reports of any irregularities. Bernie Sanders is a favorite in California and Texas. He believes that are the key states to gain the largest number of delegates. And it's also what is anticipated that is going to be a fight for the minority communities. Most definitely, Bernie Sanders is seen as a person who definitely attracts and has the support of the Latino community, especially in California and Texas, and Joe Biden, the one who attracts the minority, like the Afro-Americans in the South. There are 7 states in the South that are going to be part of these primaries that eventually he could be doing well. But what is really taking place here is what Bernie Sanders has been repeating all along the day and all along the previous days. He said, the establishment is very, very nervous with our campaign, and he's very nervous because the quote-unquote, the moderate wing represented mostly by Joe Biden and Mike Bloomberg want to become the candidate, even though so far Bernie Sanders has been organizing the largest movement and the most organized movement. It's the one that in this Super Tuesday, it has a presence in the 14 states, something that it doesn't have the movement of, or the organization of Joe Biden. In terms of the media, absolutely, after that big win of Joe Biden on Saturday, that definitely was doing extremely well in South Carolina, and the two previous candidates, we're talking about Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar, were suspending their campaigns and give them the support to Joe Biden. The media, the only thing that is talking is that he is the person that is coming from behind, that is most definitely the most viable candidate to beat Donald Trump, and they put absolutely aside Bernie Sanders, trying to confirm the suspicion that most definitely they want to repeat the same thing that was happening in 2016, that they were definitely sabotaging his campaign to put Hillary Clinton. Well, Bernie Sanders has already said, and he did it today after voting in his Vermont state, he said it's the political establishment, the corporate establishment, the establishment within the Democratic Party that they want me out. Well, we are going to see at the end of the night if it's that campaign is going to be successful, or Bernie Sanders, regardless of the efforts to derail his campaign, is going to finish victorious of this key element, key day in that Democratic contest towards the nomination of the party.
That was Jorge Gestoso in Washington. So let's take a look at who's electing who in these Democratic primaries. So far, 4 U.S. states have held their primaries or caucuses. Those are Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina, electing a total of 155 delegates to the Democratic Party convention in July. This Super Tuesday, 14 states are voting, plus the U.S. territory of Samoa and Democrats abroad, for a total of 1,357 delegates. The biggest are California and Texas, which contribute 415 and 228 delegates respectively. After Super Tuesday, there will still be 2,467 delegates to elect in the remaining states. So now for our perspective from the grassroots left, we go now to New York, where organizer, educator, and theologian with the Popular Education Project, Claudia de la Cruz, is joining us now. Thank you for coming on today, Claudia.
Thank you, Camila, for inviting me.
So what have been the issues you've been focused on throughout the campaign, or what interests you?
I mean, a lot of the work that we have been doing out of the U.S. have been connected to immigrant rights, anti-police brutality work, anti-war work, a lot of solidarity work or internationalist work with support to Venezuela, to Cuba, and other countries defending their revolutions.
So you are the executive director of the People's Forum in New York, which is a central point bringing together a number of social movements and organizers. What impression do you get from the organizers and activists on the ground in New York? Do you think they'll be supporting any particular candidate, such as Sanders, Tulsi Gabbard, and are people discussing any alternatives to those candidates?
Well, for the most part, what I've seen is that there is an excitement around Bernie Sanders, mostly because of the domestic issues that he's tackling and he's talking about are mainly working class issues that a lot of the folks in the left or in the progressive world in the United States and in New York City are also working to advance. So, for example, Medicare for all, when he's talking about student debt, which is something that a lot of candidates don't even touch, but it represents trillions of dollars in debt of many households. And so he's tackling issues, again, that are creating some sort of movement that is unified. And that's definitely attractive to many.
So what grade would you give the foreign policies of the Democratic candidates running today?
I mean, I think we need to understand the Democratic Party as it's always worked. I think it's important to understand that the Democratic Party, very much like the Republican Party, are very aligned when it comes to foreign policy. There are definitely implicit in the way in which they do their politics, in the way in which they attack countries like Venezuela and Cuba. The way in which they are attacking China right now. And so we need to be clear that the politics coming out of the Democratic Party are never going to be anti-imperialist practices or policies. I think that there is a fear from the establishment. There is a fear from the Democratic Party, mostly because when we're talking about Bernie Sanders, we're not necessarily talking about an individual or a politician. We're talking about different sectors of the working class that are coming together. Obviously, because they understand Trump is a threat, but if Bernie reaches the presidency, there's going to be much more of a massive movement that's going to be demanding radical changes. And so having him in anywhere near the presidency is a threat for the Democratic establishment and the Republicans.
So you're in New York, and in particular, we have Puerto Rican communities, Dominicans, and many other Latino and migrant residents. What have you heard from those communities in terms of whether or not they will be participating in today's primaries? Will they be casting ballots in the election? And do any of the candidates have their support?
I think we have to learn from very recent experiences. We had an entire community, immigrants and non-immigrants alike, who went out and did an organizing campaign around Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's actually very much supportive of Bernie's presidency or candidacy to the presidency. And so they're utilizing, the Bernie campaign is utilizing a lot of that organizing experience that is in New York City, tapping into the different communities in struggle to be able to move forward his candidacy. And so, yes, there have been a lot of mobilizations, a lot of people actually going out to vote for the primaries, mainly, again, because they understand that in this historical political context in which we are, there is a growing interest for socialism. And even though it is debatable whether Bernie is a socialist or not, primarily because of his foreign policy and a lot of the ways in which he has presented his position on Puerto Rico, on Venezuela, we can't really say he is a socialist, but he has elevated or put in a platform that is national the possibility of people actually accessing some other type of political system that is not capitalism. And so if we look at the polls today, 51% of the population of millennials are looking into what socialism is as a possibility in the United States. We are not, or I'm not saying at all that he is, but the imaginary of the people has been tapped into. And so from that tapping into, people are mobilizing in that direction.
Okay, so with all eyes on Iowa a few weeks ago and the process which took place there, if we see questionable results tonight and then again at the Democratic Party convention, what sort of reaction do you think the U.S. left will have? Will they finally abandon the Democratic Party and build something new?
That's a great question. I can't say that I think that they will, unfortunately, because ultimately, I'm not sure that Bernie will actually go on to build something new. I would say that he wouldn't necessarily go through the process of fighting his Democratic Party to be able to create an independent political party. But I will say that if the possibility of him becoming the nominee for the Democratic Party is stolen, which could happen from him, because we're now banking on popular vote, but we have to remember that there's a convention happening, and even if we were to win the nomination, we're talking about the Electoral College as well in terms of him actually getting to the presidency. And so we need to be clear about that. And so if it's stolen from him in any of those steps, I think there will be a lot of dissolution in the progressive leftist circles, I think that there might be massive demands and protests. I think so, but I highly doubt that there will be the creation of a third party in the United States.
Now, Claudia, I do have to ask you about the media coverage. In my memory, this is some of the most criticism I recall of the corporate media. Are people waking up to what the role of the cable and big outlets have been in continuously promoting the establishment?
I think people have been. They've been waking up. I think that there has been a process by which people understand that the corporate media ultimately shows what is in the interest of the wealthy, particularly those people who are in movements or struggles. We see how the media fails to cover the immigrant rights issues, how they fail to cover struggles around healthcare, how they fail to cover struggles around police brutality. And so I think people have a certain level of clarity that the corporate media is not on their side. I do feel that there is a lot of the creation of alternative media. There's also the use of Twitter and social media, which we know is also controlled by the elite. But there's a way of massifying and amplifying messages via those spaces. So yeah, I think folks are in a different space in the United States. I think with Occupy, with the long processes of killings of Black and brown youth, with the regression of women's rights and LGBTQ rights, people are in another space and they're ready for something more.
Absolutely. And I think Martin, who's here with me, he's a web editor here at Telesur English, has a question for you.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Thinking about Latino and Black communities in the U.S. right now, they've had experiences with Bloomberg, especially in New York, with the stop and frisk policy. Biden, which with Obama was a predecessor of the criticism now we have with migration policies, especially with Latin American migrants. Do you think these communities, these minorities, will go out and vote for Sanders or Warren or one of these more progressive candidates, or do we have that chance or that fear that they could go for the more conservative, moderate candidates?
Well, that's a good question. In terms of Bloomberg, I think from New York City, we have experiences with him that are the greatest. There was profiling, there was persecution of Black and brown young people because of policies that Bloomberg established. We know the amount of displacement and gentrification that came into the communities. I think for the most part, folks that are involved in movement and struggle, community members, exactly who Bloomberg is, they know that to a certain extent, he comes from the same businessman-like mentality that Trump does, and he again implemented policies in the New York State that were horrible. And so I don't think that people are even thinking of Bloomberg. In fact, I think for the most part, folks in New York City at least have been thinking and advocating and doing campaigns against Bloomberg as a potential candidate for presidency. With regards to Warren, I think it's important to understand why some folks might be inclined to vote for Warren. And I think, during the 2008 crisis, she was one of the people who advocated to save folks from foreclosure. And so that's been utilized a lot in the organizing around her and her possibility to become president. I think, if anything, Warren could be a strong contender against Sanders for the Democratic nomination.
Okay, and Claudia, there have been a number of people, of course, we were talking about social media, who are just very critical of Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard and the Democratic Party in general. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what's being done to build something outside of the party or even outside of electoral politics?
I think it's important for folks that understand the need of building movement to take this time to identify the folks that are actually hungry to build something bigger and something beyond electoral politics in the United States. I think it's a moment for us not necessarily to ask the question of whether we engage or not in electoral politics, but seeing who are the masses of people that are engaged in electoral politics right now. Who are the working class folks that could potentially build a movement that is a movement to take us to a space, a political and economic space that is for the working class in this country, and that is able to connect internationalist issues and anti-imperialist struggles to our domestic issues. I think it's an important moment. It's a moment that we haven't seen in many years. I would say in my lifetime, and I'm in my late 30s. I haven't seen this this desire, that it's a massive desire for changing the structure, the system, the establishment. And I think Bernie knows that. The people campaigning around him know that. What we need to do as folks that are thinking about revolutionary action, as people that are thinking about the construction of something that is alternative and it's new and is definitely outside of capitalist and imperialist ways of practicing politics, what we need to do is be able to engage with communities and organize with them around the issues, and actually also deepening their politics, to understand that the Democratic and the Republican Party are not very different from each other. What Bernie is advocating for is really not as radical as the Democratic Party wants to make it. We're talking about basic human rights that should be accessible to everyone. And in other countries, that are liberal countries, that are capitalist countries, people have access to healthcare. They have access to education. So it's not a radical demand as people want to make it. It's a very basic demand that the Democratic Party wants to categorize as radical, to be able to kind of defame him, because what is known to be radical in the United States is quote unquote bad.
On that note, we have to head to some results, but we've been speaking to Claudia de la Cruz. She's joining us from New York. She's with the Popular Education Project and with the People's Forum. Glad to have you on today. Hope to have you again.
Gracias, Camila. Thank you.
Now, the results that are coming in from Virginia, which has 99 delegates, show that Joe Biden is in the lead with 46.9% of those votes, while Bernie Sanders received 29.3%. Mike Bloomberg has secured 11% of the votes. And finally, Elizabeth Warren has 9.7%. Okay, so Martine, good to have you here with us. Let's talk about what's at stake today. What's your feeling?
I mean, today's elections, as primaries, are very important. I mean, these will be maker state elections for certain candidates. Especially if we look at Sanders in California and Texas, those will be key states for him. I mean, California, polls have shown it's a sure state for him, but a tie or maybe a loss in California could be the end for his candidacy, especially because we know the characteristics of the electorate in California. Now, thinking about Massachusetts, especially for Senator Warren, it's also very important for her to win that state. I mean, if she doesn't get that, she will be pretty much out of the race for the primaries. Texas is also a very important state in this case, not only for the amount of delegates, but for the Latino vote that will come in there as well. I mean, we'll see. I mean, Biden has a lot of chance of winning and becoming a front runner in that state, but polls have shown that Sanders could overtake that. I mean, the other states we have to look at are those southern states with black communities and black vote. I mean, those will be important, especially with the last poll, which was South Carolina. Biden taking that black vote will be important, and we'll have to see how Alabama, Arkansas, Tennessee do, and North Carolina as well. Because if he gets that black vote, I mean, it will come down to Biden and Sanders running a really tight race.
Thank you so much for that. So we're off to our first break. When we come back, we'll be joined by Michael Brooks, the host of The Michael Brooks Show. Join us again in a minute. Our guest now is Michael Brooks, host of The Michael Brooks Show, joining us from Los Angeles. Thanks for being with us, Michael.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So you've, of course, been a very enthusiastic supporter of Bernie Sanders. Give us a breakdown on what your guy Bernie Sanders proposes over Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren, candidates who some people say are progressive as well.
He proposes to give everybody in the United States full comprehensive health care. Nobody else supports that. He proposes to get rid of all student debt, which is a very major issue. It's kind of crippling in the economy of the United States. He proposes a really global and comprehensive approach to ecology and the Green New Deal, which really, in the spirit of your show, actually has a very comprehensive section on wealth and technology transfer built into it. There is definitely some understanding of internationalism in his campaign. That's why he voted against Iran sanctions, the only Democratic member of the Senate to do that, Democratic caucus, calling for freeing President Lula. And Joe Biden is, by any kind of international standard, a quite right-wing figure. He's helped sort of construct the prison-industrial complex in the United States, major proponent of the invasion of Iraq, and also somebody who more kind of narrowly but significantly has always called for cutting Social Security and Medicare. Elizabeth Warren is in no man's land in this campaign. I mean, she was never to the left and never a movement candidate like Sanders ever. That was always spin, not reality. She has a pretty narrow set of interests and narrow set of issues. She's not somebody who has a track record on anything to do with foreign policy, military policy. That's, well, certainly not positive, and not much kind of interest in things like healthcare. And as the campaign has worn on, and she's kind of chosen to sort of just relentlessly attack Bernie Sanders, her positioning, falls further and further to the right.
Okay, so what about these Trump tweets we're seeing on Bernie? Just yesterday, he tweeted, "They're staging a coup against Bernie," of course, referring to the mainstream Democrats. He says that they're working hard to destroy the name and reputation of crazy Bernie Sanders and take the nomination away from him. Is he right, and what's his strategy with these tweets?
Well, I mean, Trump is just messy, and he's ridiculous, and he likes to cause drama. And I think he does have an instinct of people's generalized disgust with the establishment, for lack of a better word. Now, coup, I wouldn't use that word coup yet. If you go to a convention where Bernie Sanders has the most votes and most delegates, and they steal it from him, then I have no problem using that word, even though it might not technically be correct because of the convention rules, and people can get very kind of focused on language. But I think obviously it would be totally undemocratic. Right now, though, the Democratic establishment is all aligned against Bernie. They are running a totally vicious campaign against him. Most of cable news, particularly MSNBC, functions as basically almost like an anti-Bernie super PAC. So he sees hay to make. It's about depressing the turnout. It's about increasing divisions of those who oppose him. And the Democratic Party, as it has been for so long, is Donald Trump's greatest strategic ally.
Okay, so speaking of cable news, yesterday Marianne Williamson, who was actually a candidate herself, tweeted that she was bumped off CNN after just a couple of minutes because Pete came on to endorse, of course, right-wing candidate Joe Biden. Let's talk about the role of the mainstream media in what is supposed to be, of course, a democratic process. What was Chris Matthews' role up until last night, Rachel Maddow's and so forth? If U.S. Americans saw this sort of behavior where the party or government establishment are so closely intertwined with the country's media, they would, of course, say that that's a sign that there exists no real liberty or democracy in the country. What tell us about the mainstream media?
We are in a really degraded democracy in the United States, and people have been saying that for decades, and I think you saw in 2016, the Republican Party and Donald Trump really formally own themselves as an authoritarian political project. The Republican Party is an anti-liberal party in the sense that they are not a party of rules, governance, and rights. And now you're seeing in this cycle the Democratic establishment, in a different way, and their media allies, they are far more worried about Bernie Sanders than Donald Trump getting reelected. And you do see that in terms of relationships and bias, right? Like, I think you don't need to kind of like go to some grand conspiracy theory to see that, one, all of these networks are corporate owned. That's antithetical to Bernie's agenda. Two, they're staffed by people who all sort of know each other and represent an incredibly thin slice of the population. They're not interested in learning about what's really driving a lot of the electorate in terms of like this broad crisis we're in with regards to inequality, with regards to healthcare, with regards to human immiseration. And they also, don't like Bernie personally. They don't like what he represents. He's not a careerist in the same way. He's not someone who has paid his respects to all of the things that they think one must respect in our society and our politics. So it's self-interest, it's personal, and it's ideology.
The establishment war on candidate Bernie Sanders, but there's also a lot of people who refuse to excuse Bernie's remarks on what many of us to believe to be the real democracies and the real socialism of the global South. Sanders has a soft imperialist progressive at best, a lot of people say. What is your response to that?
I think we've got to be really careful about what we actually mean by that, right? So I think one is there is legitimate differences that people can litigate about how we think about the nature of Chinese governance, as an example. And I think there's legitimate disagreements on that, and it would be wrong to not acknowledge that. Then there's times where I personally disagree with a line that Sanders takes on certain issues, although even when he's saying something, like even when he's giving more credence to talking points on Venezuela, as an example, this is still a candidate who is running for president of the United States and can win, who opposes the coup there. So I do think that there needs to be some calibration that people have between what people can say with media platforms and what people can say in certain very specific contexts versus somebody who is trying to major.
So you've made an appeal to your social media following to do everything you can to go out and vote, door knock, call, and text. What are U.S. Americans going to do when we find out that once again a U.S. electoral process is rigged and that Bernie and his supporters got the shit end of the stick?
Well, I don't know what that's going to mean, right? I think, again, we need to be really clear. If they go into a convention and he has the most votes, the most delegates, and they don't give it to him, then yes, that's a whole other escalation. What might happen today, and it would be a tragedy for this country and the globe, would be if, this fear-mongering, this coalescing around the right wing of the party knocked this movement back. And then the answer is, I don't know, right? Like, I think we cannot retreat to sort of like revolutionary fantasies that don't have a context yet inside the U.S. political system. But I also think that it would start to answer some really serious questions we've been asking. People have been saying that for all of the flaws and all of the limits of, first of all, the Democratic Party, obviously, and the broader U.S. electoral system, that there was this opening with Bernie, and there is this opening with Bernie. If that's shut, we're going to need to have a major strategic rethink. And I think this is hitting a lot of left-wing projects across the globe. Even someone like a President Lula, who succeeded and did so much and was conciliatory to the extent that he was willing to make alliances and compromises with the forces of capital, he still falls victim of a coup. I just think that it will require a very big rethink, but I think we're not there yet. And I actually think that the momentum is still on Sanders' side to win very major states. And we should recognize that it's not just us. We're, freaked out because we're used to being on the receiving end, but they are in a serious panic and they are throwing a Hail Mary pass. And I think it's too late for them.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We've been speaking to Michael Brooks from Los Angeles right now, host of The Michael Brooks Show.
Thanks a million.
We now go to our studios in Havana, Cuba, where Carlos Alzugaray Treto is joining us for some insight. Carlos is an essayist, a diplomat, and Cuban professor, and head of the Academy of Sciences of Cuba, among other titles. Thank you for speaking with us today, Carlos. So, Carlos, some projected results are coming in as expected. Bernie Sanders will, of course, win Vermont, and it looks like Biden is projected to win Virginia and perhaps North Carolina. Who do you think will come out on top tonight?
It's very difficult to predict. The latest projection in several websites was that Biden would come out on top. It's a pity because Sanders has been doing so well, but it depends very much of what's going to happen in Texas, because Texas is a big prize, and there Sanders and Biden were running neck and neck. So we'll have to see. We'll have to see. In any case, if any of the two come out on top, it won't be a very big difference. And we will have to wait till the end of the primary season to learn who has a plurality of delegates. I don't think anyone can have the majority of delegates. Of course, if Biden has the plurality and is on top of Sanders, it would be easier for him because the party establishment and the superdelegates would vote for him in the second round. But if Bernie Sanders comes out on top, then they'll have the problem of what to do, because Sanders is going to claim that the nomination is his because he ended with the most delegates. But we'll have to see. We don't know what's going to happen.
Carlos, regarding foreign policy, with which any of these candidates that could become president of the U.S., can we see a possible Sanders being president? Would we see a more like Jimmy Carter type of foreign policy regarding Latin America? What do you think would be sort of his approach towards the region? And with other candidates such as Biden and Bloomberg openly supporting APAC and that more conservative side of a foreign policy, what's the main difference we could see if those were to become presidents of the U.S.?
Well, it's difficult to predict what can Sanders do. Obviously, he has a very progressive point of view. He's very critical of traditional foreign policy, American foreign policy, supporting right-wing governments and right-wing dictatorships and undermining left-wing governments. But can he turn around the country? Can he really do on foreign policy? He's going to have his hands full. So there's a difference, no doubt. The difference is big because Sanders is criticizing traditional foreign policy movements that Biden has supported in the past. So we cannot expect that with Biden there would be, well, of course there would be change in terms of more like Obama-like policy, and certainly with what Trump has done, anything that comes after Trump would be much better, obviously. But there is a difference between Sanders and Biden. On Latin America, Sanders is on record of saying, hey guys, we have been intervening in Latin America, we have been doing bad things in Latin America, and we have to stop doing that. He will certainly go back on the Monroe Doctrine. As we have it right now, Donald Trump is saying that the Monroe Doctrine is enforced. Sanders will say, no, the Monroe Doctrine is not enforced, and we are going to pursue a cooperation agenda with different governments. But we'll have to see, because there are traditions in U.S. foreign policy that are very difficult to break. Take the case you mentioned, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter did a lot of good things. He changed something very important, the position of the United States on human rights and democracy, and the criticizing of right-wing military dictatorships. We owe that to Jimmy Carter. But he confronted an onslaught from the right. The right-wing media and the right-wing think tanks were constantly criticizing what he was doing. So imagine Sanders, who probably is a little bit to the left of Jimmy Carter, he's going to face a lot of resistance from the federal bureaucracy, from the powers that be, from the media. But of course, again, there is also some hope in the sense that we see a United States that is changing. There is a movement to the left. There is an acceptance of socialist ideas that didn't exist at the time of Jimmy Carter. So we'll have to see. But of course, we have to take one step at a time. Right now, Sanders has to win the nomination and then go ahead and win the election in order to change, to make those changes in Latin America.
Carlos, like you say, we have to take it step by step. And in this case, Sanders would have to first get the nomination from his party. Now, we're talking about, usually they say the U.S. is the oldest democracy. And how would you rate the democracy in the U.S. when a candidate like Bloomberg has announced that he could change everything and overturn things at the National Convention? And also superdelegates have warned that in case Sanders would win, they would be willing to vote against him to take the nomination from him at the convention in July.
Well, I think one of the problems with the U.S. political system is that it is dysfunctional and it is in crisis because it doesn't reflect exactly the will of the American people. Take the case of the 2016 election. According to the popular vote, Hillary Clinton won by 3 million votes, and yet because they have this crazy system of the Electoral College, Donald Trump became president. And not only did he become president, he was able to dominate the Republican Party in a way that no other president has done before. Of course, the Republican Party is full of conservatives, right-wingers, very reactionary kinds of guy. So Trump was able to take the Republican Party, move it even more to the right, but he's carrying out a foreign policy that is based on what he thinks. He doesn't hear the experts. He has done some crazy things. As a matter of fact, the reason why he was impeached is that he was using the foreign policy of the United States for his personal advantage. Now, this shows you how in crisis is the system that the president could do. A president that is not really, doesn't even have a clear mandate can do something like that and go against what are more or less acceptable ways of doing foreign policy, although it is an imperialist foreign policy. It's crazy, and now we have this situation now. Whoever wins the election, if it is not Trump, will have a lot of work to do in order to redesign the foreign policy of the United States. One of the problems Trump has is that he has lost the support and the confidence of the U.S. allies. I think the way that you can best characterize the situation, the international situation of the United States, is that the United States is in what some experts call imperialist overstretch. The United States is political and military engagements that go beyond their possibilities as the economy. For example, Trump has run huge deficits, and that in the long run is going to affect the United States. So I would say that because they are in an imperial overstretch and they have to manage the way they handle the relationship with the rest of the world, not using this kind of bullying foreign policy, because what Trump has is a bullying imperialist foreign policy. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if a guy like Biden, for example, who is mainstream, who is an elitist, can handle the change without producing even more harm to the United States. The fact of the matter is that the people of the world, and several countries like Cuba, like Venezuela, like Russia, like China, have been resisting and resisting successfully. Yes, Trump has done very bad things, but some of these main targets, and I will insist in the cases of Venezuela and Cuba, have resisted, and they will continue to resist.
Thank you so much, Carlos. We've been speaking to Carlos Alzugaray Treto, who is a political scientist and the head of the Academy of Sciences of Cuba, and he joins us from our studios in Havana, Cuba, of course. Now, let's take a look at Vermont, which is Bernie Sanders' home state. Bernie Sanders is the front runner with a 54.5% of the votes, and next comes Joe Biden with only 20.6%. Meanwhile, Mike Bloomberg secured just 10.8% of the votes, and last off is Elizabeth Warren with 9.7%. Now the results are just coming in from Virginia as well, where 25% of the votes have been counted, and early results show that Joe Biden is in the lead with 54.4% of the votes, while Bernie Sanders received 23.5%, Warren with 10.2%, and finally Mike Bloomberg with 9.5% of votes. Okay, so Martin, I'm excited about our next guest, but before that, tell us about some of the recent endorsements that actually went to Biden.
Well, Biden in this case has taken the usual corporate media endorsements, and let's talk about media especially. What we saw today was a new strategy they're using. Some of the headlines we saw were if in the case Sanders would take a big win, markets would fall. And we've seen this before, and not in the US. We saw it in the primaries in Argentina. When Fernandez, as a candidate, won the primaries, all the headlines across the world were markets will take a toll and the Argentinian economy will go down. Same thing, same strategy, trying to put that scare method, try to scare tactics for the voters, saying that the economy could take a big toll.
Absolutely, and so I think we have our next guest. Young voters were crucial to Obama's win in 2008, and there's been a lot of talk about young people this time around. Joining us now via Skype is Andy Villa. He's an organizer in Miami and a college student. Thank you for being with us again, Andy.
Thank you for inviting me again. How are you?
Fabulous. So my first question, are you supporting a candidate and why?
Yeah, I'm going to be voting for Bernie Sanders this election. I think the strongest reason is that he is someone that would take this country in the right direction, not only in terms of what he wants to do domestically, but I think that he's someone that has hinted at changing foreign policy in order to, cease what is, the abuse and the exploitation of countries in the global South. I think that for me, at least as an immigrant who has family in Cuba, that's really important, and for that reason, I'm going to be voting for him.
Okay, and what are you hearing from other young people, both working people and those who are in university studying, such as yourself?
To be honest, I think most people are generally open to Bernie. I think most people are realizing that, we haven't had an increase in wages in this country in about 30 years. A good portion of this country, above 25%, above 30%, don't even have health care. We saw some reforms during the Obama administration, but it just wasn't enough. And we're seeing a stage of candidates that isn't actually proposing anything to change the situation. We're seeing a stage of candidates that's just against Bernie. He's the only person who's promoting things that actually make sense. At least with working class people and in my own community, immigrants, I think, are open to him. And we saw that in Nevada as well. So.
Andy, do you think foreign policy has become any more of an issue for those around you? Do young Americans care that the U.S. State Department is issuing new sanctions on Iran and Venezuela every few days?
I think it has become really important, Camila. I think that, for a millennial and for somebody that belongs to the Generation Z, we've lived in a country that's been at war for our entire existence. We've lived in a country that has continually shown that they will stop at nothing to make countries in the global South suffer due to their own decisions. We try to get countries like Venezuela to do what we say by sanctioning, the economy and by making the people suffer. I think that all of these things have made young people more aware and have made us kind of realize that, we're fighting these wars for these rich people that in reality don't have our interests in mind. So I think foreign policy has definitely become more of an issue this election.
One last question, Andy. There are a good number of people who are critical of Sanders, Tulsi Gabbard, and the Democratic Party in general. Are you seeing anything being done, you're an organizer, of course, to build something outside of the party or even outside of electoral politics?
I mean, I think the struggle is always going to continue outside of electoral politics. I'm extremely demotivated by what I've seen in the past couple of days coming from mainstream Democrats. And to be honest with you, I think that a lot of people are going to be very upset if the Democratic Party chooses to ignore the will of the voters. We know for a fact that Bernie holds a clear, lead in a lot of states that are going to be instrumental to, pushing him to have a plurality of votes when the convention comes. And, if the Democratic Party decides to screw over the voters again, and if they decide to pick the candidate for us, I can tell you that personally, I will never vote for a Democrat again. And I will do everything that in my power to advocate for a new party. So I do think that could be something that happens if they try this.
Thank you so much, Andy Villa. We've been speaking to Andy Villa. He's a Miami college student and organizer. Hope to have you again soon.
Thank you.
Now let's go back to the United States with our correspondent, Jorge Gestoso in Washington, D.C. Good evening, Jorge. Can you give us an update on how Super Tuesday is going so far?
So far, so good. And so far we have 3 primaries that has been finished, and knowing the projection of the winners, we're talking Vermont, the state of Bernie Sanders, who was won by Bernie Sanders, 16 delegates. Then Virginia with 99 delegates that has been won by Joe Biden. After that, in 30 minutes later, was closing. We're talking about North Carolina, also won by Joe Biden, and we're talking 110 delegates. And a first win for Mike Bloomberg with an American territory, American Samoa, that is at least giving some hope to him. It's very early. We're talking that California is going to be closing at 11 p.m. Eastern time here in this area of the country. And between California and Texas, the 2 states with more delegates, we're talking about 415 delegates in California, about 224 in Texas. On both states, Bernie Sanders is the favorite. So far, the reaction of Joe Biden, that he's in Los Angeles, he has said, I'm feeling optimistic that we're having a good night. Bernie Sanders is also optimistic, and we have to wait and see. So far, Elizabeth Warren is not having a good night. Her polling is basically under 10%. And remember that in order to be able to participate in the proportional distribution of the delegates, you need to have at least 15%. So far, only Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden has reached that threshold. So far, at the moment, they are the ones who are going to be sparing and basically spreading the delegates. But we're looking every single state, and again, there is also a geographical division in terms of the minorities and preferences. We're talking that in the West and the Southwest, Latinos are behind Bernie Sanders in California and also in Texas. African Americans in the Southeast, mostly 7 states that are taking place tonight in this primary. And in those states, we're seeing the trend that Joe Biden becomes the favorite. We're going to see if at the end of the night, clearly are going to be 2 alternatives, the progressive proposal of Bernie Sanders and the quote-unquote moderate of Joe Biden, or Michael Bloomberg. We'll wait and see. We'll get back to you now.
Jorge, we see that Bloomberg is taking his first delegates, American Samoa, the U.S. territory, but he has spent around $500 million of his own pocket. Seeing also the polls at this moment, he's polling at 9% in the first 3 states that have closed polls. Do you think those $500 million and that machine he has with media, it will have some sort of effect, or do we see Bloomberg having a bad night as well?
I have to say that I was not hearing very well your question, but I'm guessing that we're talking about Bloomberg. And so far, Bloomberg has said that even though he will not have a good night tonight. He is ready to continue to commit himself to keep going through the process. And if by any chance, at certain point, he is not going to possibly become the candidate, he's ready to support the other candidates. But also he has thrown the idea that if Bernie Sanders and, for example, Joe Biden reaches the Democratic Convention and there is not a clear number of delegates, he is for a broker convention, that is meaning that the superdelegates could be the one who decide who is the candidate and not necessarily the ones who arrive to that convention with the most delegates. So we'll wait and see what is going to be the next steps of Michael Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Jorge Soso, for that roundup from Washington. Now I turn over to Martin. Tell us, when this show began, a couple of states closed their polls, and of course right now on the hour that's about to happen again, what have we seen so far?
I mean, we've seen some states that we expected certain wins. I mean, Biden taking Virginia, Sanders taking Vermont, American Samoa, Bloomberg, well, it's just 6 delegates. But what we see is Warren actually really having a really bad night. I mean, she's not taking enough to get even at least 1 delegate. We'll just have to see how the night develops. I mean, at this time, at the hour, 4 more states are closing, so we'll start seeing results in the next 15, 30 minutes. But those, especially those big ones, those are the ones we're watching out for. Texas closing at 8 Eastern time, so we'll see what happens, and especially California. California will close later, and then those are the 415 delegates that most of them will go to Sanders. So we'll just have to wait and see how the night goes. Absolutely. So how well does Sanders and Biden have to perform today to stay relevant? I mean, both are the main contenders in this race, in this Democratic race. I mean, Sanders will likely will still be the front runner after the Super Tuesday. Remember, they need at least around 2,000 delegates to win a majority. So after this, with around 30% of the delegates voted, I mean, there's still a lot to fight for, a lot of delegates to get between here and July, which will be the National Convention. Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining me on set today. This is Martin Pastor. He's, of course, web editor here at Telesur English. And we've come to the end of this special program now as the United States decides on Super Tuesday. You can find these and many other stories at our website at telesurenglish.net. And we're on Twitter at Telesur English, and I'm on Twitter at Camilla Telesur. For more on Super Tuesday, the U.S. elections, and news from the Global South, you can join us for live updates on our website, and also we're on social media on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telesur English, I'm Camila Escalante. Thank you for watching.